I wrote this article in the fall, as Micah said, and I must say it all seemed very obvious to me, but a lot of people were very troubled by it and upset by it and worried by it. I wish I could say it was overstated, looking back on it, but as I look at what's happened since that article, and since people got very worried about where our electoral system is headed, uh, on the one hand, no steps have been taken to prevent uh, the potential disasters that lie ahead of us. Congress has been unable to pass legislation repairing some of the deficiencies in the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court has created, has not been able to take a vote on the Electoral Count Act, which is the bargain of the 1876 election, which haunts us to this day when it comes to deciding what an election, what are the results of an election. All those state legislatures that have been passing laws, state laws, which allow state legislatures to pursue criminal action against poll watchers for standing in the wrong place or for any other number of things, all of which are designed to intimidate poll workers. State legislatures that have passed legislation which effectively allows a state's legislature to decide who won the election in the state rather than whatever vote count is taken by those authorities that are responsible for that. We've already now learned what a serious effort was made after the 2020 election to try to overturn it, either through sending different slates of electors to the Electoral College or having the vice president effectively overturn the election. We now know in detail that these actions were not only contemplated, but were heading down the road toward completion. The 2020 quote unquote stop the steal effort of the Trump movement was very amateurish, and they ultimately lost because a few people in critical states, people we'd never heard of before, actually insisted on having some integrity and not disavowing their own electoral count. But the Republican Party has taken steps since that time to eliminate those people and have them replaced. Trump is running candidates against the Republican Secretary of State in Georgia, who refused to find the votes that he wanted. Trump is running Republican opponents to every single one of the Republicans who voted for impeachment. The party is cleansing itself of dissenters, as we see in the case of Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. Um, we are going ahead in full force. And one of the other things that has happened since then, because one of my concerns when I wrote the article was the possibility of violence on election day or in the period following election day in the next elections. But the proclivity to violence has, if anything, only increased since then. And in the middle of this Ukraine crisis, when people are actually fighting for their homes and their freedom, we're going to have a truckers convoy fighting for the freedom not to be vaccinated and not to be compelled to wear masks, but also just not to be vaccinated. And so, as much as I would like to believe, and as a foreign policy guy, I'm now completely fixated on what's happening in Europe, and I think it's right to be. I think, as I said, history will be shaped by what happens in Ukraine going forward. But unfortunately, it is now again distracting our attention from the very great crisis that we are already in. And that crisis now ought to be very clear in two senses. One is if there is a challenge, if there is an electoral challenge, which could lead at the very least to chaos, with contested delegations in states, with protests on both sides, with potentially violence on both sides. Is it really hard to imagine weeks and weeks of violence or potential violence in states where the electoral count has been contested. I don't find it hard to believe. We're a very well-armed country, and we are increasingly, some of us are increasingly bringing our heavy weapons to protests. And so I think that's a real possibility. And you know, nothing has changed in terms of Trump's complete dominance of the Republican Party, which I find interesting because I think it's pretty clear that Trump is not fully in control of the movement that supports him. He can get crosswise with them, as he did on the vaccination question, where he wanted to be boasting of Operation Warp Speed and his role in getting the vaccine created, which is ironically a normal politician's uh, kind of boast. But his movement immediately told him that that was unacceptable and he had to backtrack and get back in the right position on vaccinations. And then it's been interesting to watch him on Russia, obviously, because, you know, basically a day before, or in fact, the day of the invasion, he was talking about how savvy and what a genius Putin is. And he has had to backtrack on that because even in Republican circles, opinion has shifted so dramatically that Republicans who were basically 50-50 or agnostic on the subject of Ukraine before are now pretty much where the rest of the country is in terms of that, which is basically sort of 75-25, being sympathetic to Ukraine and to doing more for Ukraine. So on the one hand, Trump is not completely in control, but on the other hand, politically, he still is completely in control. He's far ahead of any other candidate in the polls, and I think we have to assume that he will be the nominee. And by the way, he can win a fair election. I don't rule it out. But even his winning a fair election is a disaster for us because he has demonstrated that he has not only does he have no regard for democratic principles and customs and behaviors, but he is perfectly willing to run roughshod over them in his own interest. And next time he will not have William Barr. By the way, I never thought I'd say he would not have William Barr getting in his way, because William Barr did not get in his way very much. He's much more courageous in after-the-fact books than he was at the time. But in any case, even William Barr won't be there. Well, we will have nothing but yes people throughout the administration who have entered the administration knowing what this guy is, which some people at least could claim in 2016 that they didn't, but they will know what he is. They will know what he's done. They will know that he tried to overthrow the government and overturn an election, and they're still going to be working for him, which means they're going to help him do what he wants to do. So we have a crisis that will occur whether he is put into power illegitimately or legitimately, because we know what he is, and we can't unknow it. And that gets me back to, if we've learned one thing from Ukraine, it is that we better take seriously what people say they're going to do and have the capacity to do. So, you know, that is the situation that we're still in. Obviously, we have missed opportunities over the last few months to repair some of the institutions and rules that are necessary to provide any semblance of a safeguard against this happening. I won't go through why that's happened. You all know perfectly well as I do, why Congress has not taken any action. And so we are much closer to the next election without having in any way addressed this problem. So the only glimmer of hope that I actually have these days actually comes from this international crisis. And let me tell you what I mean. You know, it wouldn't be the first time that an international crisis shook up the domestic political system in such a way as to strengthen those who actually do believe in the idea of democracy. I think this conflict is being portrayed not only by us, but by Europeans and certainly by the Ukrainians themselves as not just an attack on Ukraine, but an attack on democracy. And it's true, by the way. What is the difference between a Ukrainian and a Russian today? Many Ukrainians are Russian speakers. They certainly are, in Putin's own terms, Slavic brothers and sisters. What is the difference? The difference is one lives under a imperfect, but nevertheless, very clearly a democratic government and wishes to be part of the West. And the other one is ruled by someone who is hostile to democracy and hostile to the West. That is the difference. It is a difference of belief, as much as anything. It is not geostrategic to some extent, although Putin, I think, sees enormous strategic benefits if he is able to acquire Ukraine. But I think it transcends even strategic considerations. Uh, Therefore, and it's been interesting, as I mentioned, to see how Republican opinion has shifted in a way that, at least for the moment, Trump and Tucker Carlson and Pompeo look like fools and are being ridiculed to some extent. Now, most Republicans don't even want to utter the word Trump. It's like Voldemort. You can't even say his name, because then you'd have to answer a question about him, which I don't think was the reason you couldn't say Voldemort's name. But in any case, that is, Republicans are now gung-ho on Ukraine. They're gung-ho on being anti-Putin. But if you ask them, what about the fact that Trump was just praising Putin 3 days ago, they stare at you blankly and answer a different question. So, all that being said, I started off this part of the talk by saying I have some hope. The hope is that at least some Republicans, and maybe for shorthand, I'll say suburban Republicans, may decide that in this world that we now live in since the invasion of Ukraine, we can't afford to have someone like Trump with his finger on the button, being in charge of this vast alliance that this administration has so successfully corralled and pulled together. Not that it was hard; they were there. But do we want to have a president who is A, unpredictable, B, ignorant, and C, his hallmark is destroying the alliance? So this may be I'm very rarely optimistic, and I'm very rarely enthusiastic about any possibility. So I'm clinging to this one. But I do think we certainly have seen, for the first time, as close to a Republican repudiation of Trump as we're likely to get without anybody actually saying it. What this translates into, I don't know. And of course, 2024 is a million years from now in political terms, and we have a 2022 election in the meantime, which will not, I think, necessarily be heavily affected by this international crisis. So that's my glimmer of hope.